And so on and so on. And so on and so on. And so on and so on.
Hey guys.
Hey Jake, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. Hello.
Good. Who are we talking to today, fellas?
We have Frank Ruda today. We have an interview with Frank Ruda. Dr. Frank Ruda, who's the senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Dundee in Scotland. We started the process for this episode reading quite a bit of material, his book and doctoral thesis, Hegel's Rabble, onto a book that he had written with several contributors called Slavoj Žižek and Dialectical Materialism, only to land on his book that he co-authored with Žižek as well as Agon Hamza called Reading Marx.
Realizing that the other two were over our head, we decided to land on the Reading Marx book, and I think we're all very glad that we did, because it's kind of a good avenue for us to talk about Marxism with Frank Ruda, and I think it'll be a great conversation.
Yeah, looking forward to it very much. Yeah. And before we let you go, you might have missed the fact that we have a Patreon account, and we have got extra content on there. And if you like what you hear, you can keep it in the form of subscribing on our Patreon. We have some conversations on there. We've started a Discord server, and the Discord should be a place where we can chat about it. And if you have any questions that you want us to ask whoever will be interviewing that week, you can fire them on there, and we can discuss all things Žižek and so on.
And if you have any episode ideas, of course, as well, or people that you think we should interview, that's a good place for it. And also, it's very helpful if you like and subscribe the channel on wherever you're listening. It means more people will get to hear the content and the interviews. So thank you for your continued support. Yeah.
And so on that note, let's roll into the interview.
And so on and so on. And so on and so on.
Enjoy the music for a minute.
That work?
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Hello. Wonderful.
Hello, good day.
Hi.
Frank, we normally only do audio, but if you'd like to have us play the voyeur, that's
No. I'm so happy
okay.
that you're saying that, because I was a bit worried that I should, have worked out more the last 2.5 years. So I'm going to turn off my camera.
You look lovely today, though.
Oh, thank you.
You're really fetching. Yeah.
Okay.
We prefer the disembodied voice approach.
Okay. Stupid fishing for compliments, even unintended. Okay, but thanks. So, okay, wonderful.
We have to acknowledge that the day has finally arrived where we're speaking, because it took us some time, at least the three of us, to organize, and we felt like we were dealing with like a bit of a waiting for Godot scenario. At a certain point, we had to prove that we were real and that you were waiting for something and not nothing. But over the time, we got to read a lot of material, Hegel's Rabble, as well as like Slavoj Žižek and dialectical materialism. But we ended up sort of landing on reading Marx and really enjoying it, because it sort of engaged us. Unlike some of the material that we've read, it produced our own thinking and really like activated us, and so we ended up really wanting to focus on that work. That's okay with you?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. I might not be the best defender of, I can try, right? But of the other contributors' work, and I'm certain Slavoj will hate me if I'm trying to make his arguments. Pretends that I understand his argument in a hermeneutic way better than he does, or something like that. But I'm certainly happy to say a lot about my contribution, if that helpful.
Yeah, that's actually going to be where most of our focus is anyway. We have Frank Ruda with us today, who wrote a book with Agon Hamza and Slavoj Žižek called Reading Marx, and that's where the three of us are gonna focus. I know that Peter wanted to start things off with a question. If you're ready to go, Pete.
Yeah, sure. In the introduction of the book, the Reading Marx book, you describe your book as a kind of collective project between you and Žižek and Hamza, in which you situated yourself within the specific philosophical and political conjuncture in which you find yourselves. How do you understand this collective project between you and Žižek? And when you say philosophical and political, does this imply that there must be kind of brought together in a new way, and that's what you're, in a sense, trying to do in the book?
Okay, well, thanks. First, thanks for having me. And that's already maybe a quite difficult question to begin with. But let me say two things at least. So we wondered how reactionary or idealistic it may appear to write a philosophical book about Marx, right? For a number of reasons. First, because, well, isn't Marx ultimately from his early days on about the realization of philosophy in something else than philosophy is in the real world? Aren't we just, I don't know, returning to a kind of ivory tower view on political things? And isn't this precisely the most vulgar, idealistic thing and, I don't know, violating approach that one can I don't know, have when dealing with Marx? So it's pure theory or something like that. But why the present, let's say, political philosophical conjuncture is because it has been a common project of a number of people, I think, to say, what does one do after the historical, practical failures of what someone like Alain Badiou would call the communist hypothesis, right? So what happens after Marx's, broadly speaking, Marx's ideas have been used, reshapen, reshuffled, and people attempted to put them to practice, the hypothesis from which Marx started understanding, let's say, a collective process of education and all the forces that resist its implementation, realization, and so forth. So what happens when you're living in a time when this hypothesis, or at least the attempts of putting it into practice, have failed, just like quite clearly? One way of approaching this is, and that's a very, very common, let's say not left-wing, but a very common way, is basically to read this as an invalidation, right? So Marx is invalidated because of Russia, because of China, because of Cambodia, and then you go on endlessly, right? And never end. Or you're basically saying, well, something needs rethinking. On the one hand side, that would be the second option, is to understand the failures, right? And that is absolutely important, because not everything was just like ruinous from the very beginning. And also it's problematic to separate the good parts and the bad parts, right? Basically saying Lenin is cool, Stalin is evil, and there is no transition from one to the other or whatsoever. So it's a very intricate discussion, but there is also a third way. And the third way is, what can one do to re-articulate after the failure of the attempts to put Marx's hypothesis into, or find a practical realization for it? What does one do with Marx's hypothesis? Right. This is a project that, for example, someone like Alain Badiou has, that someone like Žižek clearly has been engaged in rethinking with a complex set of conceptual tools and references and so forth.
Yeah, it seems as though, sorry if I interrupted, but it seems as though, given not only that, in a sense, failure of Marxist in like the real existing Marxism, for example, there's also kind of the problem it poses for philosophy in the alternate sense, where Marx presents a kind of problem for the philosophical notion of the subject, or of philosophical notion of approach to economy, for example, by historically and materially situating it. So it seems like not only accounting for the failures of in a sense, Marxism, but also for maybe the failure of philosophy to think historically and materially in the Marxist sense.
Yes, no, I very much agree. But that also means, if I understood you correctly, this also means that maybe there was too much philosophy in Marxism for a certain, right? Too much problematic philosophy, even in certain let's say, tendencies within Marxism, right? For example, it is in one way or the other. That's a trivial point that I'm now articulating, but. Of course, it is a certain philosophical position, or it has certain philosophical claims if you're basically saying that Marxism is an anti-philosophy or something like that, right? It is about a practical orientation and not the theoretical one. So why I'm saying that, and then you should correct me if I misunderstood you, is that there have been assumptions in the Marxist tradition, for example, that there is an always already ready-made subject of revolution, right? The exploited, the always not constituted as class, but nonetheless there's a subject ready to revolutionize the world or something like that, right? It's just given by the economic political order or produced constantly, and so and then you get all the endless debates. How do we get from the latent presence, from the existence of that subject that we can, for example, describe in sociological terms or whatsoever, to the subject starting to revolutionize, right? Can we make that transition in terms of, I don't know, consciousness raising, knowledge, whatsoever? How do we do that? So that has clearly been, I think, one problematic implication of, let's say, very traditional understandings of Marxism. So Žižek, I think Slavoj has repeatedly made the claim that after the failures of Marxism, right now it's precisely not the time to think of a new philosophie der Tat, a new philosophy of action, but rather take a step back and reflect, or let me put it differently, to make maybe a move back from politics into philosophy, right? This is the move that I was trying to describe. Why is that? Because if the historical conjuncture is one in which one attempts to reshape, rethink, reconfigure Marx's hypothesis, or let me put it again in the words of Alain Badiou, how does one redo Marx, right? I mean, for example, he once put it like, we have to rewrite the Communist Manifesto, and then he thinks one has to rewrite the 43, 44 manuscripts, and then one has to rewrite Capital and so forth. So how does one do that? And I take, for example, Žižek's proposal to be, well, by first returning to Hegel. Right, because Hegel offers us the lens and the pathway into a renewal of Marxism.
Right, and you, in the essay, you kind of just speaking to what you were just saying about the relationship between philosophy and Marxism, you end up in a sort of surprising place in your essay by kind of going to the oldest motif in the book, as it were, the Plato's allegory of the cave, which is a bit surprising. And I wonder if you could sort of explain your setup there, and maybe just for people who might not have encountered the cave allegory before, explain what that is, if it's okay.
Yeah, of course. So the cave allegory is something that you find in a book of Plato, right, in the Politeia. And in the Politeia, which is a long dialogue that seeks to conceive of what is the idea polis, so the idea form of political organization, if we want to put it in more modern terms. And at one point, and he uses a set of allegories, so images to describe, let's say, certain conceptual problems, and there may be a reason for why he uses these kinds of imaginary and imageries, but we can return to that. So what is the cave allegory? The cave allegory describes a setup wherein people are in chains, And the most important thing is they're enchained so that their gaze is focused in one direction, right? So they can't move their heads. And they're looking against the wall. And this wall functions something like a movie screen, because behind them there is a light. And in between the lights and where they're sitting, people walk by and they carry stuff around. And so the people and the stuff that they carry around, they throw shadows on the wall. And these shadows, this is Plato's description, I'm simplifying a bit, but these shadows are taken to be the real thing from the perspective of the enchained prisoners in the cave. So that is the setup. So we have let's say, a visual, architectural, collective, politically charged setting, right? People are in a cave. They take something to be the real thing, which is not the real thing, right? The shadows of the thing that are carried behind them, they identify as the real thing. And this is right now the real problem of the whole cave allegory, and they're strangely unaware, or totally unaware of their own situation. So they can only take shadows to be the real thing, because the only thing they know is shadows, right? So, okay, what then happens in the cave allegory is one of the enchained prisoners is freed by someone from the outside. And this prisoner first doesn't want to leave because he's so drawn to just like watching the shadows and enjoys it actually. And he's then forced out. And upon leaving the cave, he exits the cave, and he learns, one could describe it like that, to see that there is something else than the cave, right? But when he exits the cave, stuff is so bright outside that he can't see, so he can't properly discriminate anything. And but then he decides not to just like, I don't know, have a happy life outside the cave and realize that he was living in the cave all of his life, and now that he can make the difference between, I don't know, living a life under the sun and in the bright light of the day, and just leave the others be. But he decides, and Plato insinuates this is something that he cannot not decide. He decides to tell the other prisoners that there is something else than the cave. There's something outside the cave. Mm-hmm. So he returns, and just as he himself didn't want to leave the cave before being forced out, the others don't want to listen to him. So that is kind of the setup. My idea was, or my assumption, and or my experiment, if you wish, and I can say in a second after giving you the chance to react to what I just said, so that I don't speak for Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, actually, long periods of time. So my idea was to bring together what Marx is doing already, the early Marx, but then also what Marx calls the critique of political economy in its approach with the cave allegory, because both have something to do with emancipation, and both have something to do with the problematic status of knowledge, and both have something to do with the problematic status of enjoyment, and both have something to do with what it means to conceive of change and so forth. So I thought maybe it's productive to read Marx as a cave theoretician.
Right. And you're kind of doing this Žižekian short circuit there, I suppose. But I just want to focus on what you just said there about emancipation, and this idea of the myth in regard to that. So it's interesting to me because we might typically think of myths as standing in the way of like a true or sort of hard-nosed, or even in the kind of Marxist materialist sense, depiction of reality. And likewise, certain myths might be regarded as false consciousness or functions of ideology. And towards this, perhaps, and as a rejoinder, you cite Socrates' suggestion that one must, and I'm quoting you here, one must mythologize the myth. And it seems, therefore, that you're setting up the myth of the cave as being instructive of the radicality of mythical thinking outside of mere storytelling. So I'm wondering, what is the function of myth and fiction in regards to emancipation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very pointed and tricky question, because, let's say, in a very, precisely as you said, in a very classical sense, myth is the one thing we need to get rid of if we want to attain, let's say, knowledge or truth, right? Mythical thinking is problematic. It's problematic inter alia because it often assumes some stuff to be given without questioning its genealogy or critically examining it and so forth. This is why it's mythical, right? It's just like there. And we just have to take it for granted as a grant or even as a minor narrative. And so I got into this perspective of bringing together Plato's myth of emancipation, because I was working for a long period of time on another myth, on a problematic myth. And the problematic myth, you may have heard of the analytic, more or less analytic philosopher Sellers, and he coined the so-called myth of the given. So as soon as we take something just to be given, it's mythical thinking, right? And he believed that any kind of rationalism must question the assumption that some stuff is just given. You can see that, for example, if people just believe that the subject is given or that reason is just given and hence has no history and is not developed and cannot be explained and so forth. And I was particularly interested in the framework of the myth of the given when it comes to the concept of freedom, right? Because sometimes something that seems to be actually a tool of and for emancipation, like the concept or the idea of freedom, it may serve as precisely an obstacle or what inhibits and hinders it. So I started to trace the history of modern philosophy as I repeat the critique through Descartes, Kant, Hegel, Marx, Freud, and so forth, of the assumption that freedom is something that we just have, right? That is simply a given. And at one point, I thought, well, Marx is also very critical of this assumption. You will find this in even more explicit terms a bit later in Lenin. Lenin, who famously said, everyone who right now under present conditions speaks of freedom and equality is a liar, right? So these concepts themselves are empty unless society is transformed, and otherwise, if we employ them or use them, we necessarily lie. So I thought, well, if Plato's myth, the cave allegory, is something like a paradigmatic myth of emancipation, because right, it tells the story of how we free ourselves, we liberate ourselves from the chains, maybe chains into which we're born, right? If the prisoners in the cave are born into their status, if that is the case, so it is a myth of liberation and emancipation. How do these two, let's say, dimension of mythicality or mythness, which is not a word, I guess, hang together, right? So is there, and the basic assumption is that one can, and I take this already to be the lesson of Plato, that one can only overcome problematic myths with different kinds of myths. And the Marxist tradition, think of people like, even though he's a problematic reference, but nonetheless, like Georges Sorel, right, who basically says, well, what unites the working class and the proletariat and mobilizes them is a common myth.
Right.
And this kind of common myth is precisely what then later Walter Benjamin took up and called divine violence, right? So something like which is very confusing because Benjamin has a problem with mythical violence, but it's a similar structure than the structure I just described, right? One kind of, let's say, common shared myth in the sense of a narrative that provides orientation, right? And famously, you referred to let's say fictivity or fictitiousness of the whole setup. I mean, Lacan said that truth is structured like a fiction, and sometimes one needs something like these collective fictions to break fictions that one otherwise would not even identify as such.
Right. I just had a quick follow-up to that question, actually, because also in the text you write of the theme of emancipation as the real becoming human of the human being, and this seems to imply kind of ontological valence to the question of emancipation, though we might think of Žižek's ontology, which I'm not sure whether to ascribe to your position, as an ontology of failure. So is then emancipation this becoming human of the human being bound to fail?
Well, I think that is a very tricky question, because obviously, well, I mean, simply because, yes. So I think Slavoj's ontology has been more or less recently described by Adrian Johnson, and I think rightly so, as a failure first ontology, right? Some things go wrong and then something happens, absolutely. But in some sense, right, the cave allegory, things already went wrong, right? People are imprisoned in the cave, and then they have to be forced out. So it takes a long way for freedom and emancipation to happen, right? So first you're enchained, and then someone has to force you out. So, right, I mean, violently liberate you, for then you to become another violent liberator of other people in chain, right? So a lot of things already go wrong with regard to the standard and traditional understanding of, I don't know, peaceful liberation or whatsoever. But also, why I think it's tricky is that even with Žižek, I think that a failure first ontology should not be, let's say, too swiftly or too generally be overgeneralized, or put differently, made into a new transcendental structure. Because if that is the case, it wouldn't be self-applicative anymore, right? What I mean by this is, yes, everything goes wrong. This seems to be the principle by which Žižek is thinking, but that means that even this principle goes wrong sometimes, and things then simply work.
Right. Oh, I really like that. I guess, and kind of getting more into the material of your essay, then, we're sort of wondering how you kind of parse out the similar structure of Plato's cave allegory and Marx's analysis of capitalism. You refer at a certain point to Peter Sloterdijk's phrase, the world interior of capital, and it also brings to mind Mark Fisher's capitalist realism. But anyway, I'm sort of wondering if you can zero in on how you kind of make that analysis of the sort of similarities of Marx's account and the cave allegory. Yeah.
So thanks. I was motivated of bringing the two to make this kind of shortcut by a number of people who noticed that, and as Marx already quite explicitly pointed out, that capitalism is strangely world-producing, right? So it creates, for example, what Marx and Engels call in the manifesto a world market. It also creates representations of that world, whose paradigm is the world market, in what both of them call world literature. Right? So it is literally, almost in a Heideggerian sense, world building. So it's generative of a world. So what kind of world is it? A number of people, and repeatedly, have described the worlds that capitalism or capital generates as a world that can't be described in terms of in the emphatic, almost previously existentialist terms of a world, as in Heidegger or Sartre. So, for example, Alain Badiou has pointed out several times that capitalism generates a world which is no world anymore, right? Because it doesn't offer a unified, universal kind of symbolic space for potentially everybody, but it's very selective, it's segregative, and so forth. Peter Sloterdijk has marked, so it is world producing, that was my first claim, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is specifically world producing, that was the point I wanted to make with Badiou. And what is the specificity of the world? The specificity of the world that might be a world or not a world, and I can go into what that means and why that matters, has something to do with what Sloterdijk calls the world interior space of capital, and it has something to do with Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, because it is strangely a world that if one is within it, one cannot imagine to be otherwise. And that is very strange. Right, because, and this is precisely what Fisher means with or meant with the term capitalist realism. It seems to be the only game in town. There is this endlessly quoted bon mot of Frederick Jameson, right? People can't imagine the end of capitalism. It's easier to imagine the end of the world or something like that, right? So it is such a space that we inhibit, in which we that becomes so natural, so evident, so much, let's say, the medium through which we see everything. So as if the, I don't know, yellow or red or whatever glasses that we wear, simply because we have been taught everything we know within that space, right? It is like having a certain kind of focus and direction of our gaze and our practical orientation as the cave prisoners in Plato. So all this brought together led me to assume, what if the world building quality or world generating capacity of capitalism is actually a cave building capacity, because it has it is structurally comparable to what Plato describes as position and as general attitude and general practical, let's say, possibilities of the cave prisoners. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense.
It does. Well, I was curious just about how this world-producing effect of capitalism seems to be so already sort of built in, at least in this short-circuited way, to the allegory of the cave. And I was curious how Marx's logic of appearance plays in, if at all, to the setup that the cave, the setup of the cave, and how it relates sort of almost uniquely to the world-producing quality of capitalism, insofar as the subjects of capitalism can't necessarily imagine a world otherwise. And I wonder if the logic of appearance has anything to do with that.
Yeah, thanks. That's also tricky. Let me just add one thing, and I hope this might make the transition a bit more transparent, because in some sense, Heidegger made a strange distinction, and he basically said a distinction between three layers. And the first layer is inanimate stuff that does neither have an environment or a world. It just has Earth, right? Then there are animals that have an environment. What makes an environment an environment? An environment is an environment because it seems entirely natural. All the possibilities it entails don't seem to be made, so don't seem to have a history, and they don't seem to be produced. And within it act animals according to learned instinct, right? So that's the environment. And the third level is the level of the world. And the world is created by people who understand that they create worlds, right? And the way they are doing that is by projecting, by designing, so to speak, the very space in which they want to act, right? Something like that Hegel would call a positing of one's own presuppositions. Let me put it like that. So how is what kind of impact has that on the logic of appearance that is specific to capital? So, why does capitalism have anything to do with a logic of appearance? For Marx, one could very, very trivially answer, because the first sentence of Capital speaks of a logic of appearance. So if you open volume 1 of Capital, Marx basically says that the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as a gigantic collection of commodities. Right? So the very, very first sentence, the very first noun of the first volume is wealth, surprisingly. And the form in which wealth appears is as commodity. Everything that Capital does afterwards is a formal analysis, right? Because from the very first sentence, Marx is absolutely explicit that what he is doing is an analysis of form, the form in which wealth appears. But it also means that the capitalist mode of production has a logic of appearance that is specific to it, right? So, it is kind of interesting, or it struck me, that the French philosopher Alain Badiou wrote a book called Logics of Worlds, wherein he basically says, well, what is the world? A world is a particular regime and order of appearance, right? And we can distinguish worlds and types of worlds by understanding the logic of appearance. So I thought, oh, that is quite consistent, that Marx describes the world producing and world generating quality of capitalism in terms of the capitalist mode of production, to limit myself to that, in terms of a logic of appearance. So he gives a formal logic of appearance because he wants to understand the world generating powers of capital. Now, secondly, it's also interesting because that logic of appearance, after all, seems, if we for a second again rely on the distinction I introduced with regard to Heidegger, seems to be rather an environment and less a world. Because within that world, or the realm of appearance that is specific to the capitalist mode of production, there is very, very minimal world-creating potential for the inhabitants of the world, right? The world is created by, let's say, what we call capital, so a certain organizational force, let me put it like that, very, very anonymously. But everyone who inhibits that world has very minimal world-generating power. And that is interesting, because in that way, the world generated by capital seems to be rather an environment than a world. And that means we seem to be, and this has something to do with the distinction that Heidegger made, that we seem to act rather like animals do than in a, let's say, properly human way in Heidegger's terms. This needs a lot of unpacking, I think. But the interesting thing is, because I mean, in the question before, we quickly talked about that Plato describes the prisoners in the cave as not yet properly human, right? So some say it's a myth that tells us something about the becoming human of mankind, the cave allegory. It means that the prisoners in the cave are also in a, let's say, pre-human, maybe animal or whatever, or in a subhuman, in a unhuman, inhuman state. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? So I right now try to bring together the logic, right? The logic of appearance that is specific to the capitalist mode of production, with a, let's say, regressive tendency with regard to the world building quality of it.
Right.
Mm.
It's just a kind of a quick question, and it's just maybe taking kind of a brief step back, but often Marx is perhaps characterized as being a kind of vulgar materialist, and the notions of abstraction, the kind of the abstract effects of capitalist ideology are understood as kind of an idealist perspective, as opposed to the kind of good materialist analysis that Marx brings. But I think what you're doing is definitely complicating that. And is there a sense that there's kind of maybe a false dichotomy between the abstract analysis of Marx and the materialist analysis?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I mean, often, right, often one believes one just has to reduce everything to a concretely describable material form of practice, and then one is a materialist, right? But that is problematic because sometimes the concepts and notions one relies to describe material practices are themselves concepts that are very abstract.
Mm-hmm.
And also, and secondly, and this makes it worse, I think, certain things appear to be concrete, but are actually abstractions. So something that is highly fictitious sometimes can actually orient us in everyday life, right? So we don't notice abstraction immediately. We notice it when a philosopher talks or whatsoever, because then it's boring and we don't know what the reference frame is or whatsoever. but also there are abstractions where we don't realize them, right? I mean, this is something that I think is a systematic trait of Marx's thought from early to late. Let me explain that just like in a very brief way. Marx takes the position repeatedly in his early days and during the period of Capital. And this has something to do with the project that he was engaged in realizing, and the critique of political economy. This critique of political economy is a critique through, let's say, a deciphering of how this strange science that is specific to capitalism, namely political economy, works, right? So capitalism has a science that is specific to it, and Marx wants to understand how it works. Because if one understands how it works, one understands how the political economist sees the world, and the gaze of the political economist, the point of view of the political economist, is a point of view that instructs the very functioning of capital, right? So, and Marx from early on repeatedly describes this kind of specific want to be a scientific gaze as operating with strange fictitious entities. One of them, this is what I was focusing on in my chapter. One of them is the entity of the worker, right?
Right.
Because already the early Marx basically says, well, political economy constantly talks about the worker, of course, because the worker does all the work. But what is the worker doing all the work? And work is important for political economy because it's the science of that is supposed to allow a society to organize and administer itself, and that means the products of social labor. So what is the worker who does all the work in a society? It is, and then Marx says in the 1843, 1844 manuscript, he says, well, political economy sees in the worker an animal reduced to the bare minimum of its bodily needs. And that is surprising, right? Because one would immediately assume, well, even the political economist must see in the worker just a worker. But this is not the case. But political economy, when looking at someone it calls worker, sees something else. It sees a strange, almost animal entity. Marx in German uses the word cattle, right? Vieh in German. So it sees a stupid cow that just wants to sleep, drink, and procreate. Right? This is what it sees. It doesn't see anything else. That is, of course, an abstraction, but an abstraction which then is highly effective and highly influential for the whole organization of society.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? I mean,
Yeah.
this is why something highly idealist, right, highly abstract, highly non-material, just like invented, a fiction of what a worker is, becomes a material force.
Right. And there's this kind of seemingly regressive but uniquely existing aspect to the animal status of the worker that's both seems to refer to a time in prehistory when humans had to, work to survive, but then also it exists in a completely unique way under the auspices of capitalism. So I wonder. I mean, you already kind of outlined it a little bit, but yeah, just I think that the question of the unnatural animal or as you call it, the unanimal aspect or status of the worker is worth kind of going into but a little bit more if you don't mind.
Well, I think it's important to tease out, especially in reference to in the essay you speak about Marx's concept of abstraction, insofar as the worker becomes, as you say, a surplus of redoubled abstraction. Because I think this will, by teasing out the concept of the worker under capitalism or from the gaze of the political economist, will better understand how the cave allegory problematizes the traditional sense of the worker as an emancipatory actor. I think once we understand the unanimal quality of the worker in this particular framework and in your essay, then I think we can move towards a question of understanding how the workers may or may not be the subject supposed to revolutionize. Can you sort of speak about abstraction and how it functions?
Yes, of course. So what we already said just like a moment ago, right, is that Marx describes, that's the early Marx, what political economy calls the worker as being identical to a piece of cattle, right? And what does that mean? It means to a body that is reducible to a bare minimum of bodily needs, right? So, and this is how political economy calculates and operates on and with the worker, right? In all, that is all it sees in the worker. And Marx describes this abstract way of dealing with the worker, abstract because it abstracts from a lot of things that make an individual worker an individual worker, right? I don't know, he likes porn, has never read Kant, is a fan of Breaking Bad, I don't know what, right? Stuff like that, right? I mean, just like think
sounds right. Sounds just about right. Yeah.
yeah, you see. And Marx describes that first act, right, of ignoring a lot of concrete features and characteristics and properties and interests and so forth, as in terms of reduction. Marx says political economy knows the worker as reduced to certain qualities, namely the qualities of a piece of cattle. That is interesting because reduction at first sight is a form of abstraction. You just abstract certain qualities. You say, well, if we want to calculate on an economic level and we want to talk about people who do all the work, well, the only thing we need to take into account is their bodily needs, right? So you abstract from a lot of shit and you reduce what the worker is to that thing to which you abstracted it, namely the body, the entity solely considered by reference to its bodily needs. Now, what you're now doing, that's the second step. You're basically saying, and this is Marx, I think, this is early Marx already. This is just like me reconstructing it. You're basically saying, well, but this is what workers are, right? That's fully natural. This is just what they are. So you make the act of abstraction disappear. You naturalize, and of course, it is even easier if you abstract from all this intellectual interest, I don't know, amorous interests, and so forth, and reduce him or her to a natural body. So that means you have something like a reduction of a living human being, and now comes the catch, to something which only exists through the acts of abstraction, right? So the body the entity who is defined by only caring about the bodily needs does not exist as such. It only exists as such in the gaze of political economy.
Right.
So it is not like the political economists basically saying Hans and Frank Ruda are basically like ants or elephants or something like that, right? This is not what is happening, but what they're basically saying is Frank Ruda is a kind of animal that we just created fictitiously, right? Sounds like a Harry Potter novel, actually, but like a fictitious animal, right? A fictitious creature that we created to be able to administer it, to calculate, and so forth with it. It is necessarily reductive because it disregards like a myriad of things that, make Frank Ruda, right? It is reductive, it ignores shit about me, but at the same time, it treats me, in the case of national economy, it treats me as if I were only the thing to which they reduced me. But the thing to which they reduced me is not there below all my, wonderful interests and me never stopping to talk and stuff like that. Right? It's not like, what is there, but it's only there because they look at me that way. This is what I'm trying to say. Right. Is that understandable?
Mm-hmm.
The worker is simultaneously reduced and seen as like merely the fulfillment of bodily needs, so that their freedom then becomes merely the fulfillment of their bodily needs, right?
Yes. Let me give you an example. So there's this category that came into prominence a couple of years ago with Joshua Agamben, the category of bare life, right? So what is bare life? Bare life is something that Agamben sees having become manifest in extraordinarily problematic and shitty and catastrophic situations, like, for example, the camps in the 20th century. Right, and like a paradigm case of that is, for example, the Muslim in the Nazi camps. So someone who became so indifferent, he seems to have lost all his humanity, right? Everything that makes him human. It would be wrong to identify bare life simply with animal life, right? So it's not like that the Muslim simply became like a mouse. That would be a category mistake on that level. But the Muslim is produced by the extraordinary conditions, but produced in such a way that what is produced is a specific form of losing mankind or humanity, losing human features. And what I'm trying to say is, what I think already early Marx says is, when he talks about how capitalist political economy produces and represents the worker in a certain way, it is structurally creating that kind of produced loss, that kind of produced bare life everywhere, right? In the character, in the figure of the worker. So the worker is not like an ant or an elephant or a dog or a hamster or whatever, but the worker is a non-natural animal. Why? Because it's the strange animality, right? What makes him just like a piece of cattle in the case of national political economy, is produced by that very economy. It is not the substratum that is always already there. Is that comprehensible?
Yeah. So there's a kind of feedback loop happening there, you're saying?
Yes, precisely. Yes, precisely. So political economy reduces an entity to something that it creates in the act of reducing that entity to it.
Right. Maybe this is a bit tangential, but there was something that you mentioned in your essay that I found really fascinating on this note. A kind of example of this real abstraction, I suppose. The relationship that the worker has with time. And you speak of the kind of vanishing now, the disappearing now, which you relate to Hegel's notion of sense certainty. in a sort of situation where both at work, wherein the worker has to work for a definite period of time, in which they're always waiting for it to pass and to end, and when they're off work, they experience their time under the label free time. And I wonder if you can talk us through the sort of peculiar relationship that the worker has with time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument on one level is very simple. On one level, Marx at one point in his life says that the whole critique of political economy is ultimately a critique of the political economy of time, right? Because the trick, if you wish, that one of the so capitalism is a gigantic organization of time, right? It's not only a logic of appearance, it's also a logic of time. And the logic of time is interesting because if you can tell someone how he or she has to use his or her time, you're dominating him or her, right? So you don't even, there is some kind of, let's say, structural violence going on. If I tell you how you have to spend your day, right, you're going to hate me, of course, but that is a form of domination, right? A form of governing your conduct, of organizing your conduct. Why is that? Because time is, in a most immediate sense, the way in which we experience freedom, right? That is kind of the idea.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean that we understand what we're saying when we're saying we're experiencing freedom as time, but it means the most immediate experience we can have of freedom is the experience of free time, right? What is free time? Free time under capitalism is time where the worker doesn't have to work, right? So everything is determined from the perspective of an omnipresence of work, so from the perspective of a organization and administration, of a management of people's time. And when they don't do what they have to do, because otherwise they couldn't nurture themselves and feed their families and so forth, and feed their kids or whatever, what they do when they don't have free time is the absence of work. That is okay. And now something strange happens. I think this is how I would reconstruct the problem with this kind of distinction. On the one hand side, this is an idea that Adorno and Horkheimer, I think, later develop, is that when people have free time, they endlessly repeat what they do when they work. This is why they work out, right? For example, in the gym and so forth, right? So they endlessly repeat what they're getting used to all the time when they work. So free time disappears, and all there is work. This is why the idea also comes up that, I don't know, having an individual, more or less successful life always requires labor and work, right? Labor, where you have to work on yourself and stuff like that. But now what does that right now? That would be an objective description, more or less. But what I think one can also squeeze out is what a subjective experience of that regiment, the regime of time, actually does look like. And here comes Hegel's sense certainty. In Hegel, so sense certainty is a concept that Hegel introduces in one of his, let's say, most famous books, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And he introduces it in two ways. I'm only going to talk about one, in which someone tries to find something that is absolutely evident. And the thing that seems to be absolutely evident for almost everyone, actually, is that now I am here because now I'm speaking, for example, right? Or now I'm seeing the world and so forth. So Hegel basically says, well, what seems to be an evidence for almost everyone is that as soon as we say now, we say I'm now here, this I am now here, I experience myself now, this is what we experience as an evidence, right? And what I'm trying to bring out is in making this, in bringing Hegel in, how does the worker experience freedom that is experienced in the form of time, right? So again, keep this in mind. So, but Hegel then says, well, the problem is with the idea that the one certainty that I have when I say I'm absolutely certain that I'm here now and that I'm speaking now is, if that is really supposed to be an absolute certainty, I am supposed to be able to say what now means, right?
Right.
And the moment I'm trying to do that, the moment I'm trying to explain what now means, I enter, that is Hegel now, I'm confronted with the following paradox. The moment I say now is not now anymore, right? So what I think I could grasp as absolutely evident, unshakable foundation that is absolutely certain, namely now, a temporal instant, right, in which I'm absolutely certain that I'm here and have free time, to put the two levels together now, escapes me, because the now instance, the momentary instance, always, that's Hegel's argument, escapes me, at least as a sensual experience, right? The moment I say now is not now anymore. What I'm now trying to say is, this is precisely the type of subjective experience that corresponds to the strange reduction of the worker to his or her body, because the body is a sense medium, right? A medium of sensuous experience. So if there is that kind of reduction, what does that body experience as freedom? What sense certainty experiences as freedom? And what is that? An endless repetition of no moments that in the moment where I want to grasp them are always already gone. They constantly escape me. What does that mean on a more, let's say, profane level? That the moment I'm happy that the weekend has begun, it's already over because I binge watched or whatsoever, right? So the moment I'm finally getting, I'm finally ready to chill out because I'm so exhausted. I was so exhausted that I already need to continue to work.
Right.
Right. So you actually just to quote you briefly from your essay, you say that this sort of this way that the worker experiences their freedom, how they're embodied, is living in and as the reductive naturalized abstraction, and as such, the worker experiences, imaginarily feels himself whole and natural in his like fragmented state. To me, both your essay and even in Hamza's at the end, the language becomes kind of conspicuously Lacanian. And I think it's interesting because I think this would tie us into Hegel as well, is that there's a lurking negativity with an understanding of the subject as the worker through this sort of short-circuited reading of the cave. And I wonder if there was a reason why you didn't explicitly mention Lacan, but the language becomes of him. And I wonder if by speaking about sort of how the worker, who has been traditionally understood as an actor of emancipation, how we're looking at this negative constitution of the worker and the subject in capitalism and in Plato's cave, how we can tarry with that negative, and how the conversation leads from Marx and a Marxist reading of Plato's cave to a broader question of the radical negativity of the subject in Lacan and in Hegel, and how that might allow us to reformulate the problem of emancipation that seems to be so evident in the reading in this short circuit of Marx and Plato.
Yeah, well, that's a very perspicacious, I think, very perspicacious point you're making. Well, on the one hand side, let me quickly say I agree, and this is what I was insinuating. In some sense, if what I'm describing as the subjective experience that capitalism allows of freedom in the medium of time, then this is, let's say, structurally almost melancholic, right? Because even when you have free time, it's always already gone.
Right. It seems very totalizing. Right.
Yes. Yes.
Always in the past.
Yes, always in the past, even if you're just in it, right? So you're in the process of a melancholic form of unhappiness, right? I mean, just think about all this concatenation that opens up to left-wing melancholy and right melancholia and stuff like that. And what I wanted to suggest, and it has something, the connection is immediate, is that one should make the move that Freud makes to distinguish melancholia from mourning, right? And what does that mean? Well, the melancholic position seems to be at least one that tries to mobilize subjective workers' experience as somehow structurally imbued with a kind of proto-revolutionary, whatever, latent either capacity or knowledge and whatsoever. But if the worker, and this is basically what I'm saying, right? So the worker is a product of capitalism. It's totally trivial. I mean, that point is really super trivial. Where else should the worker come from, right? I mean, right? I mean, if you had a text called "Where Do Workers Come From?" in some sense, they in the times we're living in and Marx was living in, they must be produced by capitalism and its economic and productive regime. So, right. So in some sense, one could say, well, here now comes the famous line from the manifesto: capitalism produces its own grave-diggers, right? Isn't that precisely what right now the next step is? So what we're getting is capitalism producing a sujet supposé de l'avoir, right? A subject supposed to have it, namely the key to the revolution. And that subject then is, because it's a structural implication, it can be localized, right? And this will then imminently, so it's imminently produced, its conditions at least are imminently produced, and this will just have to be, I don't know, mobilized, organized, and so forth. And so what I'm trying to describe, and this is why I say I think that is the distinction between melancholia and mourning, is that one should give up the assumption, and maybe that's a triviality after all, but one should give up the assumption that there is a latent or whatever subject of the revolution, and accept and make the step, right? Because otherwise we remain structurally melancholic, and it has something to do with how we started. What does it mean to think after the failures of Marxists or communists or Leninists and so forth attempts to put emancipation into practice? If we're just saying, well, now the next time it will work out, right? That's a structurally melancholic position. So I think one should radically adopt a twofold position, and that is the position of mourning. That was all these failures are real failures. So it was really fucked up, right? One has to think through it, and it won't help. That's even worse, right? It won't help. It won't give you a toolbox. It won't give you a manual of how to do it positively. It won't give you a positive manual, a negative manual. And the next step is, and there is not even a subject just waiting to be awoken from its pre-revolutionary, non-revolutionary slumber to finally hit the barricades and turn all of this around. But one should rather start from the assumption, and that is why you may see why that is the case, why for a long period of time I was working on, but now that's the point, on the emancipatory potential usages or uses of fatalism, which is for me a way of mourning. One should give up the assumption that there is a revolutionary subject and rather start facing what it means to be in a situation where the problem is the following: what if we're in a similar situation as the cave prisoners in Plato, what does it mean to be liberated from that, let's say, enchainment? How does one conceive of being in a similar subjective position to the cave prisoners? The cave prisoners who need someone to liberate them, right? And even then have to be forced out. So how does one account for a process of emancipation in Marx's sense? If Marx himself will not, does not provide us or can help us to understand that there is now no ready-made subjects of the revolution that is just like, I don't know, lying asleep underneath as a substratum. Mm-hmm. Because the subject is nothing than its own production. This is what I'm trying to say, right? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it seems as though this is kind of the crucial question for Marxists, is like, who is the revolutionary subject? But I think what you're pointing to in terms of the kind of negative constituent element of the worker is that maybe given that Marx is generally seen as like kind of a thinker of production, kind of positive view of the way that the worker and society is made via production, that the new step is to incorporate a notion of negativity into the worker and a conception of reality. And perhaps could we understand that as maybe your and Žižek's return to Hegel, a view of adding negativity to the ontological structure?
Well, yeah, yes. Why I'm a bit hesitant? And you're fundamentally right, I think, with the general direction of what you're saying. Because that also means that, let's say, or let me bring out one implication of what you've been saying, and then I try to add why I'm a bit hesitant if I have a good answer or a good framing of another aspect. Why I totally agree is because, let's say, capitalist productivity often is fundamentally reliant on a regressive nature, right? On what Žižek describes often as downward synthesis, as utter regression. Think of, I don't know, right now there is more people who live under conditions of slavery than ever before in the history of mankind, right? And that is an essential part of the functioning of capitalism, right? So its productivity relies on increasing attempts of, I don't know, whatever concept you want to use there, on primitive accumulation or a certain form of regression or of reductions and so forth, right? So the productivity is a specific productivity, which can also be not only catastrophic and so forth, but which can also be essentially reductive or regressive. Regressive, that's the better term, right? So that means there is a form of negativity that is inscribed in very weird ways, or very peculiar ways, or very, let's say, invisibilizing ways into the very functioning of the productivity machine that is capitalism. That's one point. On the other hand side, the move to Hegel, I think, apart from the, let's say, strategic implication this has for where one could situate this whole attempt to rethink what Marx and Marxism might be about as a theory of revolution and revolutionary subjectivity. One thing that, well, Hegel allows to think, let me put it like that, is different types of negativity, or different ways in which, let's say, one can deal or has to deal with, on the one hand side, regression and reduction, and on the other hand side, with let's say, different forms of repetition. So this is, and I think Slavoj has been a absolute genius in bringing out these things. To make myself a bit clearer and not to meander too much. So I used the cave allegory to basically point out Plato's cave allegory describes emancipation through three negative moments. The first one is someone has to take off your chains. So emancipation has to start to come from the outside. That's the first point, right? That's a negative qualification in some sense. You can't do it on your own at the beginning. That means you're fundamentally incapable, and that's the second. The third one means you have to be, you're moved. You have to be forced out of the cave. And there's a fourth one. Sorry, I miscounted the first time. So, and there is a fourth one because you're going outside the cave. You have this experience of negativity, which is for Plato, and that's important, an experience of the idea of the good. So it's an experience of an idea, which is an experience of negativity, and then you're driven to return. So everything that happens, let's say, to return back to the cave. So one could reconstruct the whole setup of the cave allegory in terms of different types of negativity interacting, or different negativity experiences connected with one another. And of course, one of the great theorists of negativity is Hegel, but he's also a great theorist of the idea, right? So the idea is the very, very last concept that we encounter in Hegel's logic. And I haven't found anyone, and maybe you know that better than I do. I haven't found anyone who has, and maybe he's just like throwing it in there just like spontaneously, but Marx says the strange, so that's the early Marx in 43, 44, that the strange thing that happens is, on the one hand side, there is reduction and regression that is constitutive of capital or capitalism. And this leads to an increasing mechanization of all the actions of the workers. That's another argument, I'm just stating that. And he basically says all these, let's say, reductive, regressive mechanizations, think of labor in the factory, for example, at Marx's times, they're held together. So these institutions or these frameworks of mechanical movement are held together by what he describes as a chemical power. And the chemical power is what he identifies in money. So what now is, and that's Marx in the economic philosophical manuscripts. Now, what is interesting is that thereby Marx describes capitalism as a functioning of chemism and mechanism. I'm not meandering, but I have a point now. Hegel, before the very ends of the logic, right, before he moves to the concept of the idea, talks about the concept of mechanism and the concept of chemism as two problematic forms of conceiving freedom. In Marx's terms, one could say, money is a problematic way of conceiving of freedom, and mechanical production is also a very problematic way, and their concatenation is also a problematic way, right? So what Marx seems to be insinuating by basically saying capitalism is a concatenation, a combination of chemism and Marxism and mechanism. One needs to make the move from these two and their interaction to the next concept, namely to the concept of the idea, which is why what emancipation already in Plato was about, right? And so,
right.
So yeah, okay, stop here.
No, you by mentioning the idea, you reminded me of describing the process of emancipation in those four movements is how the prisoner is, unchained and then drawn out and sort of is blinded by the concept of the good, and then has to is then greeted with the problematic of returning. And I'm weary of maybe finishing with Lacan, but it feels like to superimpose an idea of the psychoanalytic practice, which is to come to terms with the real, and then have to and have to come back. And that's by way of a process that you actually mentioned in a footnote, which implies a master of sorts. And I'm just curious, like, this is why I think Lacan is so important, and why it's implicitly sort of tucked in there at the end, is that you say that through Marx's critique of or the reading of Plato's Cave, we can actually come to a sort of real of the shadowy realm, which is still within the realm itself. And I think I think the essay, as you've sort of suggested, is really just about what does it mean to be emancipated, what does it mean to be free in the situation as such. And I think that's why Lacan is so important, is because to traverse the fantasy, which is implicit in the psychoanalytic quote unquote cure. I feel like that's what you're suggesting here, is that there's maybe, implied the importance of a master in order to draw us out of the cave, in order to only in order to return to it. So it seems like the problem, once we introduce Lacan, is about discovering how our unfreedom is very much the process of coming to terms with our unfreedom is the only way in which we can, in fact, live in this fantasy, shadowy realm. And I wonder if this particular master exists, if you're suggesting that if there is anyone that can draw us out of the cave of capitalism, only to sort of find our place in it, to accept the fantasy, and whether or not I mean that master exists, I think has a lot to do with the problem of emancipation in capitalism.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I very much agree with your reconstruction. Yes, the idea was that, and then again, unfortunately, things I think get again a bit complicated. I think, yes, in some sense, what is needed is someone or an instance that not only loosens the chains, because right, the chains are within an allegory, so they might be highly metaphorical, right, or highly, right. It's not like we need to wear chains, but sometimes the ways in which we look at the world are the chains, right. This is what is implied. That means how to free, how one is liberated from these visible or invisible chains. It comes from the outside, and a Lacanian name for this position would be the analyst, right? Or one could say in political terms, the master. Now, with regard to the link between the analysand and the analyst, there is a tricky, let's say, a tricky implication, because the analysand is and must be, and then things get again more tricky, is in analysis on a voluntary basis, right? So he or she is there because he or she kind of, I don't know, wants to be there, or couldn't escape from being there, or, right, feels the urge that this might help, or at least believes that there is something to be gained through analysis. Right? So there is a voluntary act of submission to someone who fulfills a very strange function, because on the one hand side, we clearly know that an analyst does only know stuff about us if we tell the analyst stuff about us, right? How else should he or she know stuff about us, right? He or she doesn't, obviously, right? So without endowing the analyst with a power, with knowledge about ourselves, he or she is, with exception to his or her structural position, not in a better position than we are, right? But because he is in the position that he or she is in, this kind of, we can, and this has something to do, to make a very long argument very short, this has something to do with, let's say, how to conceive of, the end of the cure, right? So you enter on a voluntary basis. There is necessarily some kind of transferential relationship. So even you enter the room and the analyst doesn't know anything about you, and you immediately start believing that the analyst knows something about you, right? simply
Right.
because he's an analyst and something happens and therefore you hate him or love him, or will the next time be 5 minutes late or 3 minutes late or 5 minutes early or whatsoever, right? I mean, all these kinds of forms in which, let's say, transference and resistances and both interchangeably work. So not only are we talking here in terms, when we talk about liberation, about the beginning of this process, but also about how does one conceive of the ends of analysis? And I mean, let me put it very, very vulgarly. In some sense, at the end of analysis, you don't need the analyst any longer, because in a sense you yourself became an analyst, right?
Right.
And what Plato describes in the cave allegory is the one been drawn out and exiting and returning. He became kind of an analyst, right? So right now the situation is, what do we do with the analyst talking to us, telling us something, right? I mean, so my what I want to insinuate is that maybe one should conceive of an act of, let's say, or let me put it differently. So what would it mean? What does it mean to voluntarily accept someone as a master or an analyst, just under the assumption that you necessarily will be forced out and debunk him as master and analyst? Right? What does that concretely mean? What does it mean? Especially, and it's especially tricky because, let's say, voluntary labor is everywhere, right? I mean, that is one of the regressive, reified tendencies of contemporary capitalism, that it relies massively on non-paid, not only slavery, but really voluntary labor, where people tell you, I don't know, if you haven't worked in 47 different television channels, you won't be a cameraman. Right, and you work for free for ages and so forth. So the question is, what kind of voluntary action can one conceive of that is comparable and compatible to let's say the relation that an analyst has to an analyst, right? And it becomes immediately more complicated, because that must mean a kind of collective organization, collective voluntary organization that performs that very act.
Excellent. Yeah, it's quite obvious, at least in a suggestive manner at the end, about understanding emancipation as a different choice of voluntarism, because voluntarism is already implied as a kind of unfreedom in the structure of capitalism. But it seems like your essay is suggesting sort of like shifting that relationship to what we do voluntarily and how we participate voluntarily. I think that was what was so great about your essay in this book, is that it was really like something that we felt, at least the three of us respectively. I know that, like, personally, I myself lost my job because of COVID, and I'm sort of sitting around thinking about, just after reading your essay, I was like, so how am I going to, like, voluntarily sort of return? It does seem sort of like now there's an exaggerated or even acute experience of being in a cave and having to voluntarily understand how to return. We really enjoyed reading your essay, and I loathe to close, but we did want to ask you what you're working on now, and where we might be able to find you in the future, and what we can expect from you moving forward.
Okay, so well, I mean, there will be another trio book that we are working on, or started working on, more or less right now. It's and I think it's consistent with how we end. It will be called Reading Hegel. So this is one.
Very good.
So this is one project. The other one I'm working right now on, and it feels so strangely timely, on another collective book project. I wrote a book with Rebecca Cromay on Hegel a while ago, and I'm doing another one with her and the guy from Princeton called Andrew Cole on the 18th Brumaire of Marx. And the basic idea that I'm trying to follow is, I don't know if you ever read the lectures of Michel Foucault from his course that he gave at the Collège de France on the abnormal. And it's kind of interesting because in the beginning, and he just like, I don't know, throws it in as a just like passing by comment, but then does develop it a bit, but not really. He basically says, well, all kind of power relies on the possibility, or all kind of organized power relies on the possibility of the emergence of what he calls grotesque sovereignty. And he basically says, well, each time power, a given regime of power is in crisis, it uses that instrument or that tool. Say, a political regime is not functioning well and everyone sees it. What does it do? It introduces a buffoon, a clown, but a clown in sovereign position. Why? Because he takes or she takes all the attention onto him or herself, right? And basically everyone can start believing that the system would work much better without that individual, and thereby the system itself use that individual as the strategy to move the attention, to displace the attention from its own structural flaws onto that individual, right? And for Marx, this is how, in the reaction to 1848 and so forth, Napoleon III functioned in France. So the idea is to basically show in what kind of way grotesque sovereignty is actually quite a helpful concept, right? I mean, Slavoj, right, I think nowadays calls that the obscene master, right? So the grotesque sovereign is in some sense an obscene master, and I'm basically interested in a certain strange kind of forgetfulness that grotesque sovereignty always produces. I mean, Karatani, the Japanese philosopher Kujin Karatani, I think in a quite wonderful text on the 18th Brumaire, and then I stop, I promise, at one point says, well, that people and governments can still recall what they did 30 and 50 years ago, but it gets very complicated for them to still remember what they did 70 and 100 years ago, right? So things keep returning simply because I don't know, almost materially the memory span is limited, right? Or the time span that memory can deal with and administer politically. I mean, and so certain things, the ghosts of the past, in Marx's terms, right? They can return because, and this has to do something about which we also talked, because that type of grotesque sovereignty, and I think this is what Foucault misses, is specific to capitalism, I think, because it has something to do with organizing time and history.
Wow.
That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
So, Professor Frank Ruda, thank you very much for joining us and being so generous with your time. And hope we can have you back at some point soon.
Yes, it was absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Okay,
Talk soon.
Okay.
Bye, guys.
And so on and so on. 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 And so on and so on.